In the bitter winter of 1603, something was dying in Richmond Palace, and it wasn't just a queen. Elizabeth Tudor, once the most powerful monarch in England, stood frozen like a pale marble statue, her body rigid with an unspoken terror that consumed her more thoroughly than any physical ailment. For hours, she remained upright, refusing to rest, her eyes fixed on some unseen horror that haunted the shadowy corners of her chambers. Her ladies-in-waiting watched in hushed anxiety, understanding that something profound was unfolding, a battle not just against mortality, but against something far more visceral and psychological. At 69 years old, Elizabeth was a monarch who had survived conspiracies, wars, and the brutal politics of Tudor England. She had weathered assassination attempts, religious upheavals, and the constant threat of invasion. Yet now, in these final days, something had broken through her legendary composure. A vulnerability that suggested even the most powerful could be reduced to raw, human fragility. The signs of her decline had been building for months. Her legendary red hair, once a symbol of her vitality, had turned gray and brittle. Her skin, once luminous, now appeared translucent and waxy. But it was her eyes that betrayed the most, no longer sharp and calculating, but distant, filled with a profound melancholy that suggested she was seeing beyond the physical world. Those close to her whispered about her strange behavior. She would stand for hours, sometimes mumbling fragments of conversations from decades past, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. Court physicians were bewildered, unable to diagnose what seemed more like a spiritual crisis than a medical condition. Some historians suggest she was haunted by the ghosts of her past, the executed lovers, the rival monarchs, the countless political rivals she had systematically eliminated. Others believed she was confronting the ultimate loneliness of her reign, a woman who had chosen the crown over human connection, now facing her final moments entirely alone. The Tudor dynasty, her dynasty, was ending with her. Her refusal to name a clear successor had created an underlying tension that permeated the court. James of Scotland would inherit her throne, but the uncertainty of that transition weighed heavily on her final days. What drove her to remain standing, defying both physical exhaustion and the natural human impulse to rest? Was it pride? Fear? A profound psychological resistance to acknowledging her own mortality? Her body was failing, but her will remained monumental, a final demonstration of the same iron determination that had defined her 45-year reign. As the cold December air pressed against the palace windows, Elizabeth Tudor stood, a living monument to survival, power, and the complex inner world of a monarch who had transformed England forever. Her final hours were not just a personal ending, but the closing of an entire historical epoch. Something was dying in Richmond Palace, and everyone present could feel it. In the fragile landscape of Tudor England, where royal succession was a treacherous game of survival, Elizabeth emerged like a delicate yet unyielding flower, pushing through harsh stone. Born in 1533, she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a lineage that was both her greatest blessing and her most dangerous inheritance. Her early years were defined by uncertainty and danger. After her mother's execution, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, stripped of her royal status, and cast into a perilous political wilderness. Lesser souls would have been crushed, but Elizabeth possessed something extraordinary, a resilience that would become legendary. When she ascended to the throne in 1558, England was a kingdom fractured by religious conflict. Catholics and Protestants were locked in a bitter struggle that threatened to tear the nation apart. Elizabeth navigated this treacherous landscape with extraordinary political cunning. She established the Church of England, creating a moderate religious settlement that was neither fully Catholic nor entirely Protestant, a delicate balance that would become her political masterpiece. Her reign was not just about survival, it was about transformation. Elizabeth understood power not as a birthright, but as a carefully constructed performance. She never married, instead presenting herself as the Virgin Queen, wedded to her country, her people, her only true family. This was more than personal choice. It was brilliant political strategy. By remaining unmarried, she avoided the potential weakness of being controlled by a foreign husband or local nobleman. Under her leadership, England began its remarkable journey toward becoming a global power. She supported maritime exploration, granting charters to adventurers like Sir Francis Drake, who would challenge Spanish naval supremacy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 wasn't just a military victory, it was a defining moment that announced England's emergence as a world power. Elizabeth surrounded herself with brilliant advisors, men like William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, who helped her create one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in European history. Her court was a crucible of cultural renaissance. Writers like William Shakespeare flourished, creating works that would define English literature for centuries. But Elizabeth was no distant, cold monarch. Contemporary accounts describe her as passionate, intelligent, and capable of both remarkable tenderness and terrifying anger. She could be charming and manipulative, scholarly and theatrical. Her famous speech at Tilbury, rallying troops against the Spanish invasion, revealed a monarch who could transform personal vulnerability into national strength. Her reign, which would come to be known as the Golden Age, represented more than just political success. It was a moment of extraordinary cultural flowering, of national confidence emerging from decades of religious and political turmoil. Elizabeth didn't just rule England, she reimagined what England could be. Yet, beneath this grand narrative was a deeply human story. A woman who had survived extraordinary personal challenges, who had been declared illegitimate, threatened and marginalized, transforming herself into one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Her power was never inherited. It was meticulously constructed, breath by careful breath. By 1602, something terrifying was unfolding within the walls of Richmond Palace. Elizabeth, once the most formidable monarch in Europe, was disintegrating, not just physically, but in a way that seemed to consume her very essence. The symptoms were subtle at first. Physicians noticed her increasing melancholy, a darkness that seemed to seep into her bones. Her celebrated brilliant mind began to fracture. Courtiers who had trembled before her razor-sharp wit now watched with mounting horror as she became withdrawn, her legendary control slipping like sand through fragile fingers. Her body betrayed her in incremental, merciless ways. The monarch who had danced with vigor now moved with increasing difficulty, her legendary energy collapsing into a fragile shell. Physicians noted her dramatic weight loss, her skin growing pale and translucent, revealing the intricate network of blue veins underneath, a map of vulnerability where once absolute power had resided. But it was her psychological deterioration that truly frightened those closest to her. Elizabeth, who had masterfully manipulated court politics for decades, now seemed trapped in a labyrinth of her own memories. She would sit for hours in near total silence, then suddenly burst into intense, fragmented conversations with phantoms only she could perceive. The death of her closest confidants weighed heavily. Robert Cecil, her most trusted advisor, watched with a mixture of concern and strategic calculation. The Queen, who had never married, who had always positioned herself as married to England itself, was now confronting a terminal loneliness that no royal title could ameliorate. Her physicians, some of the most advanced medical minds of the Renaissance, were bewildered. They diagnosed her with a complex array of conditions: melancholia, physical exhaustion, potentially a form of profound depression that modern researchers might recognize as complex post-traumatic stress. The personal toll was devastating. Elizabeth, who had executed her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had faced the Spanish Armada, who had ruled with an iron will for decades, was now reduced to a shadow of her former self. Her legendary control, the very attribute that had defined her reign, was dissolving. Most haunting was her apparent knowledge of her own decline. Contemporary accounts suggest she understood with a terrible clarity that her era was ending. The Tudor dynasty, which had transformed England, would die with her. This was not just a personal ending, but the conclusion of an entire historical epoch. Her body was failing, but her mind remained acutely aware. Each passing day brought her closer to an inevitable conclusion she both feared and, perhaps, welcomed. The Virgin Queen, who had never allowed herself the vulnerability of marriage or childbirth, was now experiencing the most intimate and terrifying vulnerability of all, her own mortality. Something fundamental was happening, not just a medical decline, but a profound unraveling of a human being who had, for decades, represented an entire nation's hopes, fears, and ambitions. Elizabeth was not just dying. She was dissolving, layer by layer, into history. In the cold chambers of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth Tudor, once the most powerful monarch in Europe, was unraveling. The Queen, who had ruled England with an iron will for decades, now stood frozen, her piercing gaze fixed on something no one else could see. Witnesses would later describe her as a changed woman, no longer the commanding sovereign, but a fragile shell haunted by phantoms of memory and mortality. Her physicians watched with growing unease. Elizabeth refused to sit, refused to rest, her thin frame trembling yet determinedly upright. Hours passed, and she remained standing, as if movement might anchor her to the last threads of life and power. The tapestries around her seemed to whisper with shadows of those long gone. Her father Henry VIII, her mother Anne Boleyn, her beloved favorites who had died before her. The visions came in waves. Some say she saw the faces of courtiers executed under her command. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose rebellion she had ruthlessly crushed. Others claim she was tormented by the ghosts of her potential successors, the very dynastic uncertainty she had so carefully avoided throughout her reign. Each phantom was a reminder of the weight she had carried, the choices that had defined her life. Her closest attendants spoke in hushed tones about her mental state. Elizabeth mumbled about conspiracies, about threats both real and imagined. The woman who had once navigated the treacherous waters of Tudor politics with unparalleled skill was now drowning in a sea of her own memories. Her mind, once her greatest weapon, had become a labyrinth of fear and reflection. Reports suggest she was particularly haunted by the specter of succession. Having never married, never produced an heir, she knew the fragility of her dynasty. The Tudor line would end with her, and the uncertainty of what would follow consumed her final hours. James of Scotland waited in the wings. A monarch from a different bloodline, a different world. Her physical decline mirrored her mental disintegration. Once renowned for her vibrant health and strategic mind, Elizabeth was now a pale shadow. Physicians noted her refusal of food, her inability to sleep, her constant state of agitation. The body that had survived countless plots, wars, and political intrigue was finally surrendering. In these moments, Elizabeth was more human than monarch. The carefully constructed image of the Virgin Queen, the symbol of English strength and resilience, crumbled. She was simply a woman facing the ultimate unknown, death itself. Her fears were not of political defeat, but of the profound loneliness that had defined her entire life. The chamber grew dark. Elizabeth remained standing, a silhouette against the flickering candlelight, trapped between the world she had ruled and the unknown that awaited her. Her reign had been a delicate balance of power, passion, and preservation. Now, all that remained was the inevitable passage from legend to history. By late February of 1603, Elizabeth Tudor, once the most powerful monarch in Europe, had become a shadow of her former self. Her physicians watched with growing alarm as she stood motionless in her chamber at Richmond Palace. Hours passed. Her legs trembled beneath her, muscles aching, yet she refused to surrender to her body's mounting exhaustion. Medieval medical understanding suggested that lying down was synonymous with defeat, with death. And Elizabeth, who had fought her entire life to maintain control, would not be conquered, even by her own failing body. Witnesses described her stance with a mixture of awe and horror. A skeletal figure draped in elaborate fabrics, her once vibrant red hair now thin and gray, skin seal as parchment. She leaned against ornate tapestries, her fingers gripping their intricate threads, the last vestiges of royal dignity preventing her collapse. Her courtiers understood this was more than physical endurance. This was a monarch's final performance, a last demonstration of the iron will that had ruled England for 45 years. Each hour she remained standing was a defiance against mortality itself. Physical pain mingled with profound psychological torment. Elizabeth's mind wandered through the landscape of her tumultuous life, memories of political intrigue, lost loves, hard-won victories. The ghosts of her past seemed to crowd the chamber. Her executed mother, Anne Boleyn, her rival Mary Queen of Scots, the countless men who had both loved and feared her. Physicians attempted gentle persuasion, then increasingly desperate interventions. "Your Majesty," they would plead, "you must rest." But rest implied surrender, and surrender was not in Elizabeth's vocabulary. Contemporary accounts suggest she had not slept properly for days. Her body was shutting down, kidney failure, extreme exhaustion, possibly depression, yet her spirit remained unbroken. This was a woman who had navigated the most treacherous political waters of her era, who had faced Spanish armadas and internal rebellions, who had crafted an image of near-divine invulnerability. Now, in these final hours, that carefully constructed persona was crumbling. Yet, even in vulnerability, she maintained a profound dignity. Each trembling moment was a testament to her extraordinary life. A monarch who would dictate the terms of her own ending. Her closest attendants watched in silent reverence. They recognized this was more than a physical struggle. This was a spiritual battle, a final assertion of royal power against the most absolute sovereign of all, death itself. Hours passed, her legs nearly buckled, but Elizabeth would not lie down, not yet, not until she was ready. In those moments, she was both immortal and profoundly human, a queen who would choose her own moment of surrender, who would face her final transition with the same fierce determination that had defined her legendary reign. The silence of Richmond Palace was broken only by the shallow, labored breathing of a queen who once commanded an empire. Elizabeth Tudor, now a frail shadow of her former self, stood unmoving, her body rigid, her gaze distant. Hours had passed, and still she refused to lie down, defying even the most basic human instinct of surrender. Physicians moved around her with a mixture of concern and helplessness. The most powerful monarch in England was dying, and she knew it. Her refusal to be seated was more than physical stubbornness. It was a final act of control, a last desperate grasp at the royal authority that had defined her entire existence. The year was 1603. 69 years of life, 44 years of ruling, and Elizabeth had become a living relic of an era she had single-handedly shaped. Her body was betraying her, weakened by what physicians of the time described as melancholy and exhaustion. But her mind remained sharp, haunted by memories and unresolved tensions. Those close to her noticed a profound change. The monarch who had once commanded armies, who had faced down the Spanish Armada, who had ruled with an iron will, now seemed consumed by an inexplicable dread. Servants whispered about her strange behavior, her refusal to change her clothes, her insistence on standing, her sporadic conversations with phantoms only she could see. Robert Cecil, her most trusted advisor, watched with a mixture of reverence and concern. He understood the weight of this moment, the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had transformed England forever. The Tudor dynasty was about to end, and with Elizabeth's death, everything would change. Her mind drifted to the ghosts of her past, her executed mother Anne Boleyn, her rival Mary Queen of Scots, the countless political enemies she had outmaneuvered. Each memory was a wound, each reflection a testament to the incredible journey of a woman who had survived where others had fallen. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Tapestries that had witnessed decades of royal intrigue now bore silent witness to a monarch's final hours. Candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across her gaunt face, a face that had once been painted as ageless, the Virgin Queen, now revealing the undeniable mortality of human existence. Elizabeth knew the succession was uncertain. James of Scotland would inherit her throne, ending the Tudor line. The very dynasty she had protected and nurtured was about to transform, and she would not be there to guide it. Her physicians tried to convince her to rest, to lie down, to surrender to the inevitable. But Elizabeth Tudor had never surrendered in life, and she would not begin now. Each hour she remained standing was another hour of defiance, another moment of asserting her extraordinary will. As darkness settled over Richmond Palace, the Queen remained, a living statue, a monarch suspended between life and death, her eyes reflecting centuries of history, her body a testament to the extraordinary journey of a woman who had defined an entire age. In the cold silence of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth Tudor's breath became increasingly shallow, her once legendary resolve flickering like a dying candle. She was more than a monarch now. She was a living artifact of an era, the final chapter of a dynasty that had transformed England forever. Her legacy was not merely a collection of political achievements, but a profound reimagining of England's place in the world. Where her father, Henry VIII, had violently severed ties with Rome, Elizabeth had crafted a nuanced religious settlement that balanced Protestant reform with pragmatic tolerance. She understood power not as a blunt instrument, but as a delicate instrument of cultural transformation. The England she would leave behind was dramatically different from the fractured kingdom she had inherited. Her 45-year reign, the Golden Age, had seen extraordinary cultural flowering. William Shakespeare's plays were breathing new life into language. Maritime explorers, like Sir Francis Drake, were expanding England's horizons, and a nascent sense of national identity was emerging from the turbulent shadows of religious conflict. Yet, for all her strategic brilliance, Elizabeth remained fundamentally human. She had never married, positioning herself as the symbolic married to her kingdom, a complex, psychological dance of power and vulnerability. Her childlessness was both a political strategy and a profound personal sacrifice. Her identity perpetually suspended between personal desire and national duty. Her final moments were a stark reminder of her mortality. The woman who had once commanded armies and navigated treacherous political landscapes now confronted her own fragility. Reports suggest she was acutely aware of the Stuart succession, knowing her death would mark the end of Tudor rule. James of Scotland would inherit a kingdom she had meticulously prepared, a testament to her forward-thinking governance. Elizabeth understood power not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. She had transformed England from a peripheral European kingdom into an emerging global power, laying groundwork for future imperial ambitions. Her diplomatic skills, her patronage of arts and exploration, her careful management of religious tensions, these were not just political maneuvers, but a sophisticated vision of nationhood. As her breath grew more labored, she likely reflected on a life lived entirely in the public eye. From a precarious childhood marked by her mother's execution to becoming one of history's most powerful monarchs, her journey epitomized resilience. She had survived political intrigue, potential assassinations, and the constant pressure of being a female ruler in a profoundly patriarchal world. Her legacy was complex. She was simultaneously a symbol of national pride and a deeply conflicted human being. The Virgin Queen was neither purely mythical nor entirely real. She was a carefully constructed persona that allowed her to navigate the impossible expectations of her time. In these final moments, Elizabeth was not just dying, she was closing an entire chapter of human history. The Tudor era was ending, and with it, a remarkable period of transformation that had reshaped England's cultural and political landscape forever. In those final, haunting moments at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I stood not just as a monarch, but as the last living embodiment of a tumultuous dynasty. Her refusal to lie down was more than physical stubbornness. It was a metaphorical resistance against the inevitable dissolution of everything she had built and survived. The Tudor era was never just about monarchs on a distant throne. It was a raw, visceral period of human transformation, where personal ambitions collided with national destiny, where individual tragedies rewrote entire historical trajectories. Elizabeth understood this deeper than most. She had witnessed her own mother's execution, survived her father's capricious reign, and navigated a world where a woman's power was constantly contested. Her childless death meant more than the end of a royal lineage. It signaled the conclusion of a remarkable period of cultural and political reinvention. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun with her grandfather Henry VII's calculated rise from battlefield to throne, would dissolve with her final breath. No heir would carry forward the complex legacy she had so meticulously constructed. Her refusal to name a successor was itself a strategic act. By keeping the future uncertain, she maintained control even in her most vulnerable moments. The Scottish King James would inherit her throne, bridging two nations and fundamentally altering the British political landscape. But in those final days, such grand political calculations seemed distant, almost meaningless, compared to the intimate human drama of a powerful woman confronting her mortality. Elizabeth's psychological state during those last days revealed a complexity rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. She wasn't just a monarch dying, but a human being wrestling with an extraordinary life's conclusion. The visions that haunted her, echoes of past traumas, glimpses of unresolved emotional landscapes, suggested an inner world far more nuanced than her public persona. Her physical decline mirrored the broader societal transitions. Just as her body weakened, so too did the rigid structures of Tudor governance. The absolute monarchy she had embodied was giving way to more complex political negotiations. Her death wasn't just a personal ending, but a systemic transformation. Yet even in decline, Elizabeth maintained her characteristic dignity. Those who watched her, courtiers, physicians, intimate servants, witnessed not a defeated monarch, but a woman who understood the performance of power until her very last moments. Her refusal to lie down was a final, defiant statement. She would exit the world on her own terms. The Tudor era concluded not with a whimper, but with the same intense drama that had defined its entire existence. Elizabeth's death was a closing chapter that felt simultaneously personal and epic. A human story that would echo through centuries, reminding generations that behind every historical moment are profound, complex human experiences. In those quiet moments at Richmond, as life slowly retreated from her remarkable body, Elizabeth I wasn't just dying. She was writing the final paragraph of a dynasty, a narrative of survival, ambition, and extraordinary human resilience that would forever define a transformative period in English history.